God's heart in allowing prosperity in life. What does it mean for a believer in Jesus to prosper? For a believer in Jesus, the concept of prospering doesn't simply refer to worldly success or material wealth. It carries a deeper meaning, encompassing overall stability and peace in life, spiritual abundance, and a sense of fulfillment that comes from a deep relationship with God. Prosperity means that everything is going well as a result of one's efforts, and things are gradually improving. However, thinking that such prosperity is solely due to one's own abilities and hard work is a significant misconception. The moment we believe that we are prospering by our own strength, it can lead to pride, and the Bible clearly warns that pride goes before destruction. Therefore, we must recognize that prosperity is only possible with God's help and guidance. For instance, imagine a farmer who harvests a bountiful crop of apples from his orchard. If the apples were to claim that they grew and ripened on their own, it would be as foolish as taking all the credit for oneself. In reality, the farmer's careful tending, favorable natural conditions, and appropriate weather all worked together to produce the fruit. Likewise, our prosperity is not achieved by our efforts alone, but it is made possible by God's grace and care. Therefore, taking pride in or boasting about one's success ultimately leads to forgetting God's grace, which can be the beginning of downfall. The importance of God's help. We must never forget that behind every moment when we feel prosperous, God's help is always present. We often mistakenly believe that our achievements and successes are solely the result of our own efforts and abilities. However, the Bible clearly states that everything we receive is given from heaven. In John 3:27, John the Baptist declares, "A person can receive only what is given them from heaven." This implies that everything we have is granted by God, and we cannot attain anything by our efforts alone. When we achieve something, we need to acknowledge and be grateful for the fact that it was possible because of God's grace and help. God desires for us to prosper and blesses our labor and efforts. However, without His help, our efforts can be in vain, and true prosperity cannot be achieved. Therefore, every time we prosper, we should give all the glory to God and maintain a heart full of gratitude for His grace. This is the correct attitude for a believer in Jesus to truly prosper: gratitude for God's grace and love. A believer in Jesus should go beyond simply acknowledging their success and achievements. They should recognize and be thankful for God's hand behind them. No matter how hard we work, we must not forget that nothing can be accomplished without God's permission. Our prosperity comes because God's blessing is upon us, and His grace and love have touched our lives. Understanding that God is leading our lives and fulfilling His will through us is crucial. However, this does not mean that our effort and hard work are meaningless. God delights in our labor and helps our diligence bear fruit. The key is to recognize that God uses our efforts and to maintain a grateful heart toward Him. Prosperity is not achieved by our efforts alone, but is possible when God's help and blessings are with us. Therefore, believers in Jesus should always be thankful to God and deeply rely on His grace. The danger of pride and the sense of entitlement. One of the most significant dangers for a believer in Jesus when they prosper is pride. Pride deceives us into thinking that all we have achieved is the result of our own abilities and efforts. This pride eventually leads to a sense of entitlement and expectation of reward, which can result in rejecting God's grace. The Bible repeatedly warns about how pride and a sense of entitlement can block God's grace. In the parable of the workers in the vineyard in Matthew 20, those who came early expected greater rewards and complained. This was because they overestimated their efforts and disregarded the grace given by God. Such a sense of entitlement leads to dissatisfaction and complaints, ultimately blocking the opportunity to receive greater grace. Similarly, if we attribute our prosperity to ourselves and adopt a proud attitude, God's grace may be cut off. Therefore, a believer in Jesus must always remain humble, be thankful to God, and maintain an attitude of exalting Him. What constitutes prosperity for a believer in Jesus? The prosperity of a believer in Jesus is not merely about external success or material wealth. It encompasses a comprehensive life success, including spiritual, mental, and physical richness and peace granted by God. Prosperity is achieved within a deep relationship with God, and it is impossible to attain without His grace and help. Believers in Jesus must remember that this prosperity comes from God's blessing and guidance. Our prosperity does not simply end with visible success or material wealth. It also includes the inner peace and satisfaction that come from a restored relationship with God and living in obedience to His will. The prosperity of a believer in Jesus is achieved by God's grace, and it can be obtained through deep communion with Him. Therefore, it is crucial to attribute our prosperity to God and maintain a thankful attitude for His help. Factors that hinder the prosperity of a believer in Jesus. However, not everyone prospers. Even believers in Jesus can face situations where they do not prosper. Several factors may hinder their prosperity in such cases. First, if someone has a confused and foolish mindset and walks in a direction opposite to God's will, God may not help them. A person who goes in a different direction from God will eventually fail. Second, being in a state of sin blocks God's grace and is a significant factor that prevents prosperity. Without the restoration of their relationship with God, their prosperity will be hindered. Third, the influence of evil spirits often negatively impacts a person's life, leading to situations where they do not prosper. In such cases, unless the influence of evil spirits is removed, it will be challenging to achieve prosperity. Therefore, we must thoroughly examine these hindrances and take necessary actions to fully enjoy the prosperity that God provides. Characteristics of prosperous people. What characteristics do prosperous people possess? They earnestly seek God, communicate with Him through prayer, and seek His help, regardless of their circumstances. For example, Jabez, despite his name meaning sorrow, earnestly prayed to God, and his life was blessed and prospered. This was possible because of his earnest prayer and trust in God. Joseph, despite facing difficult situations, relied on God and eventually achieved great success by becoming the prime minister of Egypt. He never left God in any situation, and through God's help, he overcame difficulties and finally attained great prosperity. Likewise, a believer in Jesus must seek God's help in any situation and maintain an attitude of relying on Him. We must remember that prosperity is achieved by the blessing that God gives us regardless of our circumstances. Moreover, prosperous people humbly acknowledge that everything they have achieved was given by God and maintain an attitude of thankfulness toward Him. Important attitudes for achieving prosperity. Finally, let's discuss the important attitudes that a believer in Jesus must have to prosper. First, humility. We must have a humble heart that acknowledges and gives glory to God for blessing our lives whenever we prosper. Humility is a crucial factor that enables God to give us more grace. Second, gratitude. When we prosper, we must recognize that it is due to God's grace and maintain a heart of thankfulness toward Him. Gratitude enriches God's grace and directs our hearts toward Him. Third, maintaining an attitude of exalting God. We must recognize that our prosperity comes from God and have an attitude of exalting and giving glory to Him. By doing so, we can avoid falling into pride and complacency and maintain a deep relationship with God. The prosperity that God gives is achieved by His grace, and the best thing we can do is to thank Him for that grace and serve Him humbly. We must always remember that prosperity is not achieved by our efforts alone, but is possible through God's help and love. When God blesses our lives and achieves prosperity through His grace, we must humbly serve Him and live a life that glorifies Him. This is the true path of prosperity for a believer in Jesus.